the government falls again in January 1933. They have the election. The Nazi vote is down from where it was the previous summer, but this time they go, okay, Hitler can be chancellor, but we'll manipulate him. Oh, how wrong they were. He's manipulating everyone. And then Hindenburg, who is the president, dies the following summer, and he's able to get rid of the presidency. There is no more president of Germany. There is just the Führer, him. And he gets rid of, he has enacts the Enabling Act, which is where all other political parties are disbanded, and suddenly you've got a totalitarian state, just like that.
I think there's a lesson there. There's many lessons there, but one of them is don't let an extremist into government and assume you can control them.
Yes, the arrogance of the existing politicians who just completely screwed it up.
I mean, there's a real power to an extremist. Like, there's a person who sees the world in black and white can really gain the attention and the support of the populace.
Yes.
Especially when there's resentment about, like, Treaty of Versailles, when there's economic hardship, and if there's effective modern technology that allows you to do propaganda and sell the message. There's something really compelling about the black and white message.
It is, because it's simple. And what Hitler does throughout the 1920s is he sticks to this. There is actually, when he comes out of prison, there's the Betrayal Putsch in November 1923. He gets charged with treason, which he has been, because he's attempting a coup. And he gets sentenced to 5 years, which is pretty lenient for what he's done. And he then gets let out after 9 months. The Nazi Party is banned at that point, but then comes back into being. And the year that follows, there is then a substantial debate about where the party should go. And there are actually a large number of people who think that actually they should be looking at how the Soviets are doing things and taking some of the things that they consider to be positive out of the communist state and applying those to the Nazis. And Hitler goes, no. We've just got to stick to this kind of Jewish Bolshevik thing. This is how we're going to do it. This is how we're going to do it. Goebbels, for example, who is very open. He's very, very. Joseph Goebbels is he's a not very successful journalist. He is, but he does have a PhD in German literature. He's very disaffected because he was born with talipes, which is more commonly known as a clubfoot. He's disabled. He can't fight in the First World War. He's very frustrated by that. He's in a deep despair about the state of Germany in the first part of the early 1920s. He's looking for a political messiah, a sort of quasi-religious messiah. Thinks it's Hitler, then discovers that Hitler's not open to any ideas at all about any deviation, but then sees the light. Hitler recognizes that this guy is someone that he wants on his side. And so then goes to him, makes a real special effort. Come to dinner. I think you're great. All this kind of stuff. Wins him back over. And Goebbels has this complete volte-face. Discards his earlier kind of, Hitler's right, I was wrong. Hitler is the kind of messiah figure that I want to follow. I want to follow the hero leader. And they come on board and they absolutely work out. And Hitler completely wins out of all dissenters within what had been the German Workers' Party to what becomes the German National Socialist Party, becomes the Nazis. He comes out, emerges as the absolute undisputed Führer of that leader of that party, and what he says goes, and everyone toes him behind it. And part of the genius of that, Hitler does have some genius. I just don't think it's military, but he does have some genius. There's no question about it. Is this simplicity of message? What he's doing is that kind of us and them thing that we were talking about earlier on. It's the kind of either or. It's kind of It's my way or the highway. It's kind of, this is the only way. This is how we get to the sunlit uplands. This is how we create this amazing master race of this unification of German peoples, which dominates the world, which is the preeminent power in the world for the next 1,000 years. Or it's decay and despair and being crushed by our enemies, and our enemies are the Jews and the Bolsheviks, the communists. And what he taps into as well is Frontgemeinschaft and Volksgemeinschaft. And there's no direct English translation of Volksgemeinschaft or indeed Frontgemeinschaft, but in its most basic form, it's community, it's people community, or front veterans community. So the Frontgemeinschaft is, we are the guys, we're bonded because we were in the trenches. We were in the First World War. We were the people who bravely stuck it out, saw our friends being slaughtered and blown to pieces. We did our duty as proud Germans, but we were let down by the elites, and we were let down by this Jewish Bolshevik plot. We were stabbed in the back. The myth of the stabbing in the back is very, very strong. So we're bound. We're bonded by our experience of the First World War and the fact that we did what we should and what we could, and we didn't fail in what we were doing. We were failed by our leaders and by the elites. So that's Frontgemeinschaft. Volksgemeinschaft is this sense of national unity. It's a cultural, ethnic bonding of people who speak German, who have a similar outlook on life. And again, that just reinforces the us and them,
good and evil.
It reinforces the black and white worldview. And then you add that to this very simple message, which Hitler is repeating over and over again. Communists are a big threat. Jews are a big threat. They're the enemy. You have to have an opposition in the them and us kind of process, and that's what he's doing. And people just buy into it. They go, "Yeah, we're together. We're Germans. We're a brotherhood. We've got our Volksgemeinschaft." And so he cleverly ties into that and taps into that, but they're an irrelevance by the late 1920s. By 1928, he's not going to get a deal for Mein Kampf Part 2. He's impoverished. The party's impoverished. Numbers are down. They're kind of, at best an irrelevance.
We should say he wrote Mein Kampf at this time when he was in prison.
Well, he writes most of Mein Kampf in prison, in Landsberg prison, and then he writes the rest of it in what becomes known as the Kampfhausel, which is this little wooden hut in the Obersalzberg. And you can still see the remnants of that. And unfortunately, there's still little candles there and stuff in the woods, and by neo-Nazis and what have you. But that's where he wrote the rest of it. It was Jean-Jacques Rousseau who says man has his greatest thoughts when surrounded by nature. That was something that kind of Hitler took very much to heart. Mm-hmm. There was a mentor of his called Dietrich Eckart. Dietrich Eckart introduced him to the Obersalzberg and the beauty of the southeast Bavarian Alps around Berchtesgaden, and that was his favorite place on the planet, and that's where he eventually bought the Berghof with the royalties, it has to be said, from Mein Kampf, which went from being almost pulp to suddenly being a runaway bestseller, unfortunately.
Can you actually comment on that? It's a shitty manifesto as far as manifestos goes. I think there's a lot of values to understand from a first-person perspective, the words of a dictator, of a person like Hitler, but it just feels like that's just such a shitty.
Yeah, it's banned in a number of countries. You don't need to, because no one's going to read it because it's unreadable. It's very untidy. It's very incoherent. It's got no. There's no narrative arc, to use a kind of a writer's phrase. But it does give you a very clear. The overall impression you get at the end of it is a kind of communists and the Jews are to blame for everything.
Yeah, but there's also the component of, predicting basically World War II there. So it's not just they're to blame for everything.
He's hungry for war.
Right.
He thinks that this is the natural state, that we have to have this terrible conflict, and once the conflict's over, Germany will emerge victorious, and then there will be the 1,000-year Reich. I mean, I'm finding myself in talking to you, I keep saying this kind of, it's Armageddon or the 1,000-year Reich. It's because it comes up. It's unavoidable, because that's how he's speaking the whole time. It's just this same message over and over and over and over again.
It's a pretty unique way of speaking, sort of allowing violence as a tool in this picture, that there's a hierarchy, that there's a superior race and inferior races, and it's okay to destroy the inferior ones.
Yeah.
Usually politicians don't speak that way. They just say, well, here's good and evil, we're the good guys, and yeah, maybe we'll destroy the evil a little bit. No, here is like there's a complete certainty about a very large number of people, the Slavic people. They just need to be removed.
Well, they need to be made an irrelevance. We have to take it. And if that kills millions of them, fine. Then they can sort of squish their way over to Siberia.
Right, doesn't matter where they go.
Kamchatka, wherever they go. I don't care.
We just need to populate this land that belongs to the German people.
Yeah.
Because they're the superior people.
There's no question that he glorifies violence and war. He's absolutely chomping at the bit. And in a way, I think he's a bit disappointed that in the 1930s, the conquests that he does undertake are also peaceful. March 1938 goes straight into Austria. There's the Anschluss. Not a shot is fired. 1936 goes into the Rhineland, reconquers that, retakes that over that from the occupying Allies. Not a shot is fired. He takes the Sudetenland, barely a shot is fired, and then goes into the rest of Czechoslovakia in March 1939, and again barely a shot is fired, and it's a bit disappointing. He wants to be tested. He wants to kind of have the wartime triumph. You can see him being frustrated about this in the Munich crisis in 1938. He wants a fight. He's absolutely spoiling for it. He's desperate to go in. He's all ready and gung-ho. He's built his Luftwaffe. He's got his panzers now. He's got his massive armed forces. He wants to test them. He wants to get the show on the road and prove it. He's an arch gambler, Hitler.
You make it seem so clear. But all the while, to the rest of the world, to Chamberlain, to France, to Britain, to the rest of the world, he's saying he doesn't want that. He's making agreements. Everything you just mentioned, you just went through it so quickly. But those are agreements that were made that he's not going to do that. And he does it over and over. He violates the Treaty of Versailles. He violates every single treaty, but he still is doing the meeting. So maybe can you go through it, the lead up to the war, 1939, September 1st? Like, what are the different agreements? What is the signaling he's doing? And what is he doing secretly in terms of building up the military force?
Yes. So he, part of the Treaty of Versailles, you're allowed a very, very limited armed forces. There's restrictions on naval expansion. There's restrictions on the size of the army. There's restrictions on the weapons you can use. There are you're not allowed an air force. But he starts doing this all clandestinely. There are people in Kruppersgott, for example, which is in the Ruhr, a sort of big armaments manufacturer. They are producing tanks elsewhere and parts elsewhere in say the Netherlands, for example, and then shipping them back into Germany. They're doing panzer training exercises actually in the Soviet Union at this time. There's all sorts of things going on. The Luftwaffe is being announced to the world in 1935, but it's obviously been in the process of developing long before that. The Messerschmitt 109 single-engine fighter plane, for example, is created in 1934. So they're doing all these things against it, and the truth is he's just constantly pushing. What can I get away with here? What will and of course, Britain, France, the rest of the world, the rest of the Allies, they're all reeling from the Wall Street crash and the Depression as well. So have they got the stomach for this? Not really, and perhaps actually on reflection, the terms of the Versailles Treaty are a bit harsh anyway. So, maybe we don't need to worry about it. And there's just no political will. There's no political will to kind of fight against what Germany's doing. Then he gets away with it. So he suddenly starts realizing that actually he can push this quite a long way because no one's going to stand up to him, which is why he makes the decision in 1936 to go back into the Rhineland, which has been occupied by French, Allied troops. At that point, he just walks in, just goes, do your worst, and no one's going to do anything because there isn't the stomach to do anything.
That was a big step in 1936, remilitarizing the Rhineland. I mean, that's a huge step of like, oh, I don't have to follow anybody's rules, and they're going to do nothing.
And he's looking at his military, and he's also looking at response. So one of the things they do is it's very clever. So they get over the head of the Army of the Air, Armée de l'Air, which is the French Air Force. And they invite him over, and Erhard Milch, who is the second in command of the Luftwaffe, invites him over. So come and see what we're up to. We want to be. You're our European neighbours. We're all friends together. This kind of stuff. Come and see what we've got. And he takes him to this airfield. There's a row of Messerschmitt 109s all lined up, like sort of 50 of them. And the head of the Army of the Air sort of looks at it and goes, "Crikey, that's impressive." And Milk goes, "Well, let me go and take you to another airfield." And they go off the sort of the back route out of the airfield and a long circuitous route in the Mercedes. Meanwhile, all the Messerschmitts take off from that airfield, go and land at the next airfield. Here's another, and they're all the same aircraft. And the commander-in-chief of the Army of the Air goes back to France and goes, "We're never going to be able to beat Germany." So you were alluding to this earlier on. How much is this sort of this chutzpah of this ability to kind of portray the mechanized Moloch? It absolutely cows the enemy. So they're increasing the effectiveness of their armed forces purely by propaganda and by mind games and by talking the talk. And you look at, we might all think these military parades that the Nazis have look rather silly by today's standards, but you look what that looks like if you're the rest of the world. You're in Britain and you're still reeling from the Depression, and you see the triumph of the will. You see some of that footage, and you see these automatons in their steel helmets, and you see the swastikas, and you see hundreds of thousands of people all lined up and Sieg Heiling and all the rest of it. You're going to think again before you go into war with people like that.
It's also hard to put yourself in the mind of those leaders now that we have nuclear weapons. So nuclear weapons have created this kind of cloak of a kind of safety from mutually assured destruction. Yes. You think surely you will not do, 1 million or 2 million soldier army invading another land, right? Just full on gigantic hot war. But at that time, that's a real possibility. You remember World War I. You remember all of that. So, okay, there's a mad guy with a mustache. He's making statements that this land belongs to Germany anyway because it's mostly German populated. So, and like you said, Treaty of Versailles wasn't really fair, and you can start justifying all kinds of things to yourself.
And maybe they got a point about the Danzig corridor. They are mainly Germans, German-speaking people there, and it's disconnected from East Prussia, which is this thing. I sort of get it. Maybe they've got a point. And is Poland really a kind of thriving democracy anyway? Not really. By late 1930s, it's not. It's to all intents and purposes a dictatorship in Poland at that time. I mean, it's not right that you just go and take someone else's country. Of course, you can't do that. But you can see why in Germany people are thinking they've got a point. You can also see why in France and Britain they're thinking, well, do we really care about the Poles? I mean, is it worth going to war over? But there's kind of bigger things at play by this point. That's the point.
Yeah, but before we get to Poland, there is this meeting, September 1938. So Chamberlain made 3 trips to meet with Hitler.
Yeah.
Which culminated in the Munich Conference.
Yeah, on the 30th of September, yeah.
Where was Chamberlain, Hitler, Mussolini, and Daladier, Prime Minister of France. They met to discuss essentially Czechoslovakia without any of the government officials of Czechoslovakia participating. And Hitler promised to make no more territorial conquest, and Chamberlain believed him.
He chose to believe him, I think, is the thing. It's the point. So it's very interesting. So Chamberlain gets a very bad press.
Uh-oh.
Well, no, I'm not. No, it's not really. It's. I just think there's too much retrospective view on this,
Right.
And that's fine, because the whole point of history is you can look back and you can judge decisions that were made at a certain point through the prism of what subsequently happened, which of course the people that are making the decisions at the time can't, because they're in that particular moment. So I don't think Chamberlain did trust Hitler, but he wanted to give him the benefit of the doubt. Britain was not obliged to Czechoslovakia at all. France was. France had signed a treaty with Czechoslovakia in 1924. But Britain had not. So there was no obligation at all for Britain to do this. The only reason why Britain would go to war over Czechoslovakia is because of the threat of Nazism and what the ramifications of not going to war with him. But the problem is that Chamberlain's interesting, because in 1935 he was Chancellor of Exchequer, and when they started to sort of think, okay, we really do need to rearm, he was very much in favor of substantially expanding and rehabilitating the Navy, so updating existing battleships and so on, and also developing the Air Force. Mm-hmm. There's not really much argument for having a large army, because if you have a large army, you've got to maintain it. Britain is a small place. Where do you put them? You've also got to transport them. That's complicated. You've got to train them. You've got to put them in barracks. You've got to feed them, all this kind of stuff. There's a kind of sort of impracticality about having a large army. Whereas navies are great, because you can keep them at sea and they can be, on the water. Air Force is slightly different. Air power is viewed in very much the same way that naval power is viewed. That we're an island nation. We have a global assets, and air power gives us the flexibility that an army doesn't. So he is all for backing the expansion of the army, of the Air Force and the Navy in 1930s. Then he subsequently becomes Prime Minister and sticks to his guns on that. It is he that enables the Air Force and the Air Ministry to develop the first fully coordinated air defense system anywhere in the world. There is not an air defense system in Poland, nor Norway, nor Denmark, nor the Netherlands, nor Belgium, nor France. There is in Britain. Britain is the only one. And frankly, it pays off big time in the summer of 1940. So you have to give him credit for that. Britain, interestingly, is also the world's leading armaments exporter in the 1930s, which is amazing, really, when you think everyone complains about the fact that we weren't rearming enough. Actually, we were. When we had all the infrastructure there, and we were expanding that infrastructure dramatically. I say we, I'm only saying that because I'm British. So they were doing that. But in 1938, Britain wasn't ready for war. Now, you can argue that Germany wasn't ready for war either. But Chamberlain was Prime Minister in a democracy, a parliamentary democracy, when 92% of the population were against going to war in 1938. There is not a single democratic leader in the world that will go against the wishes of 92% of the population. Now, you could say, well, he should have just argued it better and presented his case better and all the rest of it. But at that point, there was no legal obligation to go to the defense of Czechoslovakia. Czechoslovakia was another of these new nations that had been created out of 1919 in the Versailles Treaty. Who was to say, we in Britain are able to judge the rights and wrongs of that? How fantastic it would be to go to war with a nation a long way away for people whom we know very little, etc., etc. I'm paraphrasing his quote, but I'm not saying it was the right decision. I'm just saying I can see why in September 1938 he is prepared to give him the chance. Now, I do think he was a bit naive. And what he also does is this really interesting thing. So he goes over to Hitler's flat, completely ambushes him, goes to his flat on the afternoon of 30th of September and says to Hitler, look, I've drawn up this agreement here. And this is to continue the naval agreement that we've already made. And by signing this, you are saying that Germany and Britain should never go to war with one another. And it goes, yeah, well, whatever, signs it.
Yeah.
Chamberlain comes back, lands at Hendon, waves this little piece of paper, peace in our time and all the rest of it, which obviously comes back to bite him in a very big way. But it's interesting that when Hitler then subsequently goes and moves in, France and Britain decide in rather the same way that there's been discussion about deciding that large portions of Ukraine should just be handed over to Russia without consulting Ukraine a few weeks ago. It is incredible, I think, that France and Britain and Italy with Germany are deciding that, yes, it's fine for Germany to go in and take the Sudetenland, without really consulting the Czechs. It's a sort of similar kind of scenario, really. And it's equally wrong. But when Germany does then go and take over the whole of Czechoslovakia in March 1939, that's the bottom line. That's the point where Chamberlain goes, okay, I've given him the benefit of the doubt. No more benefits of the doubt. That's it. That is, he's crossed the line. And so you reinforce your agreement with Poland and you do a formal agreement. You go, okay, we will uphold your sovereignty. If you are invaded, we will go to war with you. And that is a ratcheting up of diplomacy and politics in a very, very big way. And it is that decision to make a treaty with the Poles is not heeded by Hitler, but it's heeded by literally every one of his commanders. And it's also heeded by Goering, who is his number two and who is obviously the commander-in-chief of the Luftwaffe and is president of Prussia and all the rest of it, and is the second most senior Nazi. And he's going, this is a catastrophe. This is the last thing we want to be doing, is going to war against Britain and indeed France.
The Munich conference is a pretty interesting moment, I would say, in all of human history, because you got the leaders of these bigger than life nations and the most dramatic brewing conflict in human history. Yeah, Chamberlain, Hitler, Mussolini, Daladier. It's interesting when these bigger than life leaders are in a room together. Is there something that you know about their interactions?
Yeah, I think I think one of the things that's interesting is that Hitler's got home advantage because it's on his turf. And, to start off with, the first meeting is at the Berghof, his beloved place in the Obersalzberg overlooking Berchtesgaden in the Alps. So he's pretty confident because this is my manor, this is my turf, I'm not going to be bossed around by these guys. But Chamberlain, for example, is going there thinking, I've been around the blocks. No one can teach me anything. I've been a politician for ages. I'm not going to be kind of cowed out by this sort of, Austrian upstart. So they're both coming at it with a kind of sort of slight kind of superiority kind of complex. Interestingly, when you get to the actual meetings at the Bernabeu in Munich a couple of weeks later, Chamberlain is cheered by the crowds when his car comes in when he goes to his hotel, when he's moving from his hotel to the Bernabeu. There are crowds cheering him, waving Union Jacks, all this kind of stuff. Hitler does not like that at all. Not at all. Puts him on the back foot. And that's because the German people don't want war. In the same way that the British people don't want war, nor do the German people. Yeah. The difference is that Hitler is a dictator and an autocrat and has the devotion of the people. So he can do what he wants in a way that Chamberlain can't. Chamberlain's hands are tied because he is an elected prime minister, an elected leader, political leader, and he's not head of state. So there is no question that it is Hitler and Chamberlain that are the top dogs in this particular discussion. Daladier takes a backseat. Even Mussolini, although he's there, he doesn't want war either. He wants to be left alone to do his own thing without anyone getting in the way, but he doesn't want to sort of, it's not in his interest to have a European war. So he's trying to avoid it. So it is really, you see that the kind of alpha males in the room are Chamberlain and Hitler. And it's really interesting because Hitler's got this sort of slightly garrulous voice and very kind of pale blue eyes and such distinct features, quite a long nose. And, he always says this is why he has the moustaches to kind of, disguise the big nose. So as I was saying to you earlier on before we started recording, he does have a sense of humor. It's maybe not one that you and I would kind of tap into, but he does have one. Whereas Chamberlain is just sort of, he sounds like a sort of, a bit like an old man, he's sort of silver-haired and he looks like a sort of archetypal kind of British gentleman with his rolled up umbrella and his, and his Homburg hat and all the rest of it. So they're both sort of caricatures in a funny sort of way. And yet the consequence of these discussions, these great events happening, you're absolutely going, either which way the Munich crisis comes out, you're taking a step closer to war. It's just whether the war is going to happen kind of next week or whether it's going to happen a year hence. But it's, the Munich crisis obviously doesn't stem the inevitability of war at all. It just heightens it.
Do you think there are words that Chamberlain should have said, could have said